Hello and welcome to Medfield TV and the first podcast from the Medfield Anti-Idling Coalition. We are a local citizens initiative in Medfield, originally started by the Green Sanctuary Committee at First Parish Church. We're currently under the umbrella of two local environmental organizations, Sustainable Medfield and Medfield Environment Action, and we're supported by the town government as well as local civic organizations and businesses. My name is Fritz Fleischmann. I am joined to my left by Kathleen Thompson and to my right by Steve Resch. Kathy is a member of our working team and the vice chair of the Medfield Board of Health and the former nurse leader for the Medfield Public Schools. Steve is a health decision scientist, formerly the chair of the Medfield Board of Health and a longtime faculty member at the Harvard School of Public Health. And he's now Medfield's Director of Public Health. Thank you both for being here today. Our concern is with the unnecessary idling of gasoline or diesel-powered vehicles. This practice is a resource problem, a climate problem, and a public health problem. Idling is a resource problem. Idling vehicles in the United States waste approximately 6 billion gallons of fuel annually, which breaks down to over 16 million gallons wasted every day. Personal vehicles account for about half that total, creating significant CO2 emissions. Idling is a climate problem. An idling car emits roughly 17.6 pounds of carbon dioxide per hour, depending on engine size. If we eliminated unnecessary personal vehicle idling entirely, that would be the equivalent of removing 5 million vehicles from the road. Today, we're focusing on the danger that idling presents to public health, and specifically to children. From the research our team has done, here is a brief presentation.
Hey, let's talk about something we all do, probably without even thinking twice about it. Letting our cars idle. Just leaving the engine on. It seems totally harmless, right? Well, as we're about to find out, what's actually coming out of that tailpipe is way more shocking than you'd ever guess. Of course you have. We all have. You're waiting to pick up a friend, you're grabbing a coffee, or you're in that long line of cars waiting for the school bell. It just feels easier to leave the engine running. But what if I told you that in those few minutes, you're sitting in a concentrated, invisible cloud of some seriously dangerous stuff? So let's get right to it. What is really coming out of your car when it's just sitting there running? I can tell you it's not just some harmless vapor. It's a chemical cocktail, and it has a serious hidden cost. 150. What is that? Well, think about it like this. For every single minute your car is idling, it produces enough exhaust to fill 150 balloons. And we're not talking about party balloons here. We're talking about balloons filled with harmful chemicals. Now just picture that long line of cars at school pickup. That is a lot of toxic balloons. Now, here's something that might surprise you. You'd think a car that's just sitting still would be cleaner than one cruising down the highway, but it's actually the complete opposite. See, an idling engine doesn't run very efficiently. The fuel doesn't burn completely, and the result? It pumps out an incredible 20 times more pollution than the same car moving at just 32 miles per hour. So what's in those 150 balloons? It's a pretty nasty list. You've got carbon monoxide, a silent gas that literally starves your brain and heart of oxygen. Then there are nitrogen oxides, which are awful for anyone with asthma, and they irritate everyone's lungs. You've also got these tiny, invisible things called fine particulates that can get lodged deep inside your lungs. And on top of all of that, benzene, a chemical that's known to be linked to cancer. This stuff is a direct threat to our health. All right, so you might be thinking, well, that's bad for the air outside, but I'm safe inside my car. But here's where this gets really surprising. The research shows that often the most dangerous place to be is right behind the wheel. And that's not just a guess. This comes from a science experiment where they actually put air quality monitors inside cars. The results were crystal clear. When you're stuck in traffic, you're basically sitting in a concentrated bubble of pollution. Your car is sucking in the exhaust from the vehicle right in front of you. And just look at how big the difference is. Drivers and passengers can breathe in up to 9 times more air pollution than a cyclist on the same road. Crazy, right? Well, it's because your car's ventilation system is pulling that exhaust from the traffic all around you and concentrating it right where you're sitting and breathing. And here's the part that is truly alarming: the impact all this has on our kids. Of all the people who are exposed to this stuff, children are by far the most vulnerable. Their little bodies are still developing, and they just aren't equipped to handle this kind of toxic hit. It really comes down to simple biology. Kids breathe faster than adults, so they take in more pollutants relative to their size. And they're literally closer to the ground, right at tailpipe level. The health effects are serious and well documented. We're talking about higher rates of asthma and allergies, reduced lung function, even impacts on how well they can focus and learn. This isn't a small thing. It can actually affect their development.
Now, finally, to our panelists. Let me start with Kathy Thompson. Kathy, what got you interested in air quality in general and in this anti-idling initiative in particular?
Well, I've been a pediatric nurse for about 45 years, first at Children's Hospital and the last 26 years in the Medfield Public Schools. And so I've always been interested in air quality indoor and out. Our numbers for kids with asthma are similar to the state levels. About 12% of our kids have asthma. You would think Medfield would be really under that when you think of like inner city schools and things, but we're usually just slightly under the state average, which is 12.8. But so that's really a concern to school nurses. We see a lot of kids with inhalers. I remember one instance when I first started in the schools, and I was called to a classroom where a child was really struggling to breathe, and of course everybody's very anxious, both the child and people around them. He did fine after having his inhaler, but I noticed a window was open, and lots of bus fumes were coming into the classroom. It was springtime, the window was open. The buses would pull in 20 to 30 minutes in between their runs, and that certainly gave me pause with all these fumes coming in.
They would sit there idling.
The law did change on that, and the bus companies followed that. And a very savvy school secretary made a pot of coffee in the teacher's room, had all the bus drivers come in during the, and they loved that. So it made the culture change a little bit easier. And there are signs posted, that there's no idling where the buses pull in. So that, issue eventually got resolved. And that got us looking at, with this group, how else could we decrease idling around children? As your presentations will show that, poor air quality really affects children greater because their respiratory rates are higher. They're smaller stature. They often are right in the way of idling. So we started working with the anti-idling group. Of course, Fritz started all this, as he mentioned, at the First Parish Church Green Sanctuary Committee. He came to the Board of Health a couple of years ago, and I was a member from the Board of Health on Sustainable Medfield, and had recommended Fritz go there. And Sustainable Medfield made air quality the action of the quarter. And we started a subgroup with 4 of us, and we last summer decided to tackle the idling of parents in line, and we met with the school superintendent. And that was really helpful. Dr. Marsden is a big supporter of the environment. Those of you who don't know, he's an avid fisherman, and he got right to work listening to us, what we needed, and he rolled out this anti-idling campaign by putting our flyers with the opening of school packet, which every parent reads so they know what bus their kid is going on and when school starts. And that was really helpful. The elementary schools, the Dale Street School where I used to practice, they put the flyer on the back of the parent placard that had to go in the windshield so that every parent was looking at it all the time. And the school resource officers were involved. And Fritz, I believe, you met with the police chief?
I did.
So we had involvement from the police, and not that the school resource officers, ticketed anybody, but they were there at the beginning of the year. Now, it's an established procedure. I've been in the schools a few times and, over the year and sort of tracked that a little bit. And parents aren't idling. So and it could be, parents would pull in and sometimes be sitting there for a half hour. It's kind of like the kids being first in line. Everybody wants to line up early and, get out of there quickly. And so that's been a really nice thing to, have that happen. So, yeah, we're really happy with that.
Community works. Community works.
Community
right.
does work.
Thank you, Kathy. Steve, from a public health perspective, what do you think are the chief concerns about this idling?
Of course, idling a car for a period of time is something we've all done, probably without thinking about it, myself included. But idling more than 5 minutes is illegal. And it's prohibited for a number of good reasons. Just to focus on it from a public health perspective, I think probably the chief concern has to do with the health harms that come from being exposed to the pollution. Idling cars generate far more pollution than moving cars. And this pollution builds up near the idling vehicles, exposing people that are nearby to unnecessary health risks. And of course, in many of the settings where you see idling cars around Medfield, there are children around because it's sports events or schools and that sort of thing. One thing to think about is that the local environment around the idling cars, because if you have groups of idling cars, that's especially bad for those car occupants who are breathing each other's exhaust, as well as the nearby pedestrians. So I would say that's probably the most important thing from a human health perspective.
Okay, so let me ask you, in your capacity as a health economist, what are the main costs to the public of this? I'm thinking not just of course, the money that is wasted by burning all this fuel, but what about the healthcare system? What about the infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So I think if we wanted to focus on, economic costs, certainly the most direct cost is what you mentioned, is just the wasted fuel. The Department of Energy estimates that 3 billion gallons of fuel are wasted each year in the U.S. from passenger vehicles, private passenger vehicles, personal use vehicles. That is just a pure waste of money and resources. Taking a step back, the next one would be healthcare costs associated with the diseases that are caused or made worse by exposure to car exhaust pollution. People who already have respiratory conditions, asthma being one example, but COPD, other things, that is made worse by exposure to the particulate matter and the different chemicals in the car exhaust. And those costs are really paid by all of us in the form of higher insurance premiums and higher taxes paid for Medicare and Medicaid programs. If we think of it as concentric rings, if you take another step back, there are the environmental costs associated with the excess greenhouse gases caused by idling. And for environmental economists, they often talk about something called the social cost of carbon. And that's been estimated to be something around $80 or $300 to $300 per ton. And that depends a lot on discount rate, which means how do you value things that happen in the future relative to today. But if we just take a rough example and think about the social cost of carbon being about $150 per ton, and that's a monetary representation of all the costs associated with the damage of climate change and greenhouse gas and such. 30 million tons of carbon released from unnecessary idling of personal vehicles translates to $4.5 billion a year, according to the Department of Energy. So that $4.5 billion a year is not the value of the fuel, what it costs to buy the gas. That's the monetary value of the damage caused by the environmental damage caused by the
Right.
the
This is what economists usually call externalized costs, right?
Yes.
So the externalized costs are those that are not directly charged to the user, in this case, the driver of the car, but to the
Right.
community overall, right? There are
Exactly.
many examples of that, but this is a glaring one.
Exactly.
Right. So thank you, Steve. Kathy, you already talked a little bit about working with the schools, right? You worked with the public schools for many years. Can you say a little bit more about your interactions with the schools and the community during this campaign? The reason I'm asking this particular question is that I think that an initiative such as this also can have a community building effect. That is to say, people come together with a cause that is really, to me, a no-brainer, that is common sense, but talking about it, communicating, brings them together. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes. We sort of had support from the top down, which was
Right.
great, starting with the superintendent. Our 4-member group met with various people in the schools and the community, starting with principals, and they had already heard about during the summer, heard from the superintendent about this new procedure. So it was, he had already primed them, which was great. But we not only met with principals, but then met with teachers
Right.
and content specialists, so that we had input, from all over, which was really great. Not only did we meet with the teachers that headed up environmental groups at all levels in the school system, but there's a student-led environmental group, which was really great to have, members of our group interface with. So we got input from the kids, and not only from environmental groups, but the kids taking art classes actually made graphics at the high school for, our slides and presentations, which was really great to, involve people all over.
That's wonderful. And word gets out. So the 2 other members of our team, Kate Blood and Deborah Gavarich, were with me at a Medfield event called Do Good Day, where we had a table and I handed out our flyer, our anti-idling flyer, and I spoke to a number of young families that were passing by, and several of the moms said to me, "Oh, I already know about this from school." And I've already stopped idling. So this was very nice, and they were extremely congenial about this. And I got no resistance because it is such a common sense idea, right?
It also happened at Medfield Day at the Board of Health booth. We passed out that flyer also, and it was the same thing.
How do you see your own role on the Board of Health impacting environmental air quality and health issues?
Well, I think we can have a big impact. We had one instance just going back before we started this campaign in the schools last summer, where a local trucking company the drivers were, sometimes half a dozen of them, parking at a local coffee business and sitting there idling for, they do need to idle to keep their cement moving, but they would sit there sometimes for an hour and a half at a time. So myself and another Board of Health member started tracking it, and then we eventually met with the police chief, who made a phone call and sent a letter. And although the trucks initially just moved a bit to a different location, it's now been resolved, although I did see them in a different town recently. But that was just that was a lot of impact. It was it was after
Right,
school. Right. The kids were all over the place there. That was, you could just visibly see all the pollution that was going on, right near the center of town. As far as going forward, one issue that's before the Board of Health right now is to update our tobacco regulations, which we've been working on for a few years. And Medfield belongs to a group called Shared Services, and that's with the towns of Dover, Sherburne, Needham, and Medfield. And we get a sizable grant, over $325,000, to sort of enhance public health in our towns. Well, Needham has done this nicotine-free generation where you don't sell tobacco products to anybody currently under 21. You won't sell tobacco products to them ever in their lifetime in your town. Until about 6 months ago, Dover passed a nicotine-free generation, which, you know, a town very similar to ours, or smaller, which gave us pause and sort of reopened the discussion. And we are going to have a hearing in April 14th, to get public input to see what their thoughts are on this. And again, another kind of community building thing, I've been talking to lots of local health providers, as well as some of the kids. I had a health advisory meeting at the high school today with some high school students. And there's a group, 84 Breathes, or I think they're now called Medfield Breathes, group at the high school, which one of the high school nurses is a mentor for and very involved with. And they're going to come and speak at our hearing. So it'll be really interesting to see where this goes. I think it would have a huge impact on the health of our residents, especially our children, if this does pass. So I'm very excited about that going forward. It will be decided at the Board of Health level.
At the Board of Health level. Oh, okay,
Yes.
good.
So we'll have a hearing. We've already discussed it at one meeting. We'll have a hearing for public input.
Okay.
Both things can be written and come in, and then the Board of Health will take a vote on that.
Excellent, excellent. Steve, last question. Where do you see opportunities for towns like Medfield in general to affect public behavior around health issues?
Issues like this are interesting because they're even though it's illegal and there is technically a fine that you could get for idling your car for a long time, it's really kind of a difficult thing to enforce. It's not necessarily the highest priority for our police officers to focus on. It does kind of depend on people choosing a behavior. And, you know, I think the first step is the opportunity to increase awareness and dispel myths. Podcasts like this, to some extent, right, help get the word out, signage, events, and so on. And the hope is that, you know, many people may idle their cars out of habit, but if you're able to just make people aware that, oh, this does have several consequences, they might change their behavior if they know it's illegal and costly and harmful to their health and their family and their community's health, and that is damaging the environment. And the other part of that is that, and again, this is sort of thinking of it as a decision scientist or a health economist, that often there are trade-offs. There's costs and benefits. And I think in the case of idling, a lot of the quote-unquote benefits are really myths or things that were true perhaps in the past, that are no longer true. So, I mean, I remember growing up thinking, you know, having my dad say, oh, well, you know, you want to idle the car because it's more fuel efficient than turning the car on and off, or that it creates less wear on the starter motor of the, you know, there are things like that we thought about idling, which are just not true. As part of this podcast, we have a video that kind of talks about, you know, how even if the idling is for 10 seconds, at that point it's worth turning off the car from a fuel perspective. So if people have a cost-benefit equation in their head, they may think that they're doing something that actually for a reason, but that reason isn't true. And so, you know, education can help with something like that. You know, I also want to just say that there are, you know, even from a health perspective and trade-offs, there can be times you think about an extremely cold day, and if you have to sit in a car for half an hour because for some reason, and it's extremely cold, some limited amount of idling or turning the car on and off to keep the heat on might be the right choice from a balancing of health harms and risks. But we just want people to think about that and be more, thoughtful about, do I really need to keep the car on in this moment? Increasing awareness also, I think, can sometimes gradually create a sort of a social pressure or a desire to act more responsibly. Once it's hard to not see it. I think just over my own lifetime, I think we've seen this happen with cigarette smoking. We've seen this happen with usage of car seats for kids, right? And bike helmets even for kids, right? Which is, gradually, as people became aware of the health risks, it kind of shifts the social norms towards healthier behaviors. And people at that point either want to do it or maybe feel some soft pressure to do it, and that's okay too, I think.
I saw that recently. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the Dale Street School for Read Across America, and I was reading to Bethany Sager's class, who runs the Green Team at the elementary school, and she does have student representatives from every classroom, which is great for this grade. It's not just like a little after-school program for a few kids. And one of the kids asked me afterwards, to tell him about the Board of Health and if there was anything new. And I sort of mentioned this, and one of the kids said, "Oh, yeah, I yelled at my mom the other day when she was idling because I know that, we learned that that's right." And I thought, wow, that's great. It starts, at the top and at the bottom. It's great to have that education from kids and have kids educate us.
And this, in the long run, is more effective than laws. So let me talk about that for a minute. Over half of the states of our country have anti-idling laws and regulations, as does the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In fact, the Massachusetts statute has been on the books for almost 2 decades. In fact, the special regulation for idling in front of schools was finalized in September 2009. So this is how old this is. Unfortunately, this law is as widely unknown as it is widely unenforced. I think the first ticket is $100, which is way more than what a normal police officer in a town like Medfield would hand out to somebody caught for the first time. So, in our next podcast, we will address the question of how to spread the word, which you just addressed, and how to forge larger civic alliances that can help us alleviate this troubling practice. So, before we close today, we would like to recognize our participating allies in this anti-idling initiative. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Steve, for joining me for this podcast today.
My pleasure.
Yes, thank you.